Welcome. In this video, we're going to be looking at a model that was designed by a man named Geert Hofstede. And this model is a approach at trying to understand cultures based on several different dimensions. Now, I want to say up front that every time you build a model of something, whether it be of a jet plane or a race car or even a culture, you're going to be inaccurate in some respect, right? Models by their nature are always wrong in some way or another. But what models are for is to help us come close in approximation to what we're trying to better understand or better set an example for, right? So the pursuit of Hofstede's theory is to come approach cultures in a way that helps us to compare and contrast and hopefully leads to better understanding. So I want to tell you a little bit about Geert Hofstede. He is a Dutch social psychologist. And back in the 1960s and 70s, he was hired by a lot of large corporations. Most prominently, he was hired by the IBM Corporation, which was at the time one of the largest companies in the world. And he was asked to create some kind of a way of helping IBM employees better engage cross-culturally, because IBM was a growing company. It was becoming transnational. It was becoming global, and so they knew that if they were going to be successful globally, they needed their employee base to be able to work in teams that were diverse and represented a lot of different cultures and languages and ideology and so on. And so Geert was brought in by IBM to try and create some system for training of employees to help them better engage with people from different cultures. And so that's the origin of this this theory that he put together. He interviewed and surveyed IBM employees from 40 different countries all around the world. And his goal was just to provide a framework for understanding and comparing different national cultures with one another, so that in a way that made sense to everyone involved, so that people could look at his model and say, yes, this seems true. This helps me to better understand the cross-cultural interactions and communication that I'm engaged in. His goal was also to set out and help researchers and educators and businesses navigate some of the cultural differences. And in general, his broad goal was to just improve cross-cultural communication and cooperation between peoples and organizations. So his work is very relevant to what we're doing here in international studies. And he's not the only person who set forth a theory and a model for this kind of cross-cultural interaction. We're going to be looking at a couple of others, but this is one of the primary models that we can look at to try to help us start to understand some of the major differences between cultures. So his model includes 6 cultural dimensions, and there's a little bit of variation in how they're presented at times. So you might see additional dimensions added on some list, or you might see the terminology used for different dimensions a little bit different. But these 6 different dimensions were sort of measured on a scale that ran from 0 to 100, and we're going to be looking at that scale in just a bit to try to better understand it. But that's Geert Hofstede. He's the creator of this model that we're going to be looking at, and he's written several books. So if you're interested in the topic that we cover in this video, then I would recommend that you go out, find some of his writing, and I think you'll appreciate some of what he has to tell us. So on your screen, you see an infographic that labels each of the 6 dimensions of Hofstede's theory. And we're going to take a look at each of these dimensions here with a brief sort of definition, and then we're going to look at some scale graphics that will help us to maybe better understand how these dimensions play out in the real world in a more concrete way. So the first one we'll look at is power distance. This is represented often as PDI, power distance index. And basically, this is measuring the extent to which less powerful members of a society accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. Some places around the world, some cultures accept that power is distributed unequally. They expect that to be the case. And in other parts of the world, in other cultures, there is an expectation that power will be distributed more equally. And by this, I mean authority, right? The ability to make decisions, laws, and power can be financial, power can be legal, right? It can be, so we're talking about just power in general. In countries with a high PDI, meaning they have a high power distance index, there's an acceptance of hierarchical order with clearly defined ranks. So authority figures are respected and rarely ever challenged. Some countries that have a high PDI, for example, are countries like Malaysia, Mexico, India. In these countries, you would rarely find people who might fall at the bottom of the the ladder of status, right? You're not going to find them challenging people at the top of that ladder as often, right? Again, this is a model. We're trying to understand the differences between countries by comparing them with one another, and we're never going to be absolutely perfect in those generalizations. But a country with a low PDI is where people strive to equalize the distribution of power. They demand, justification for any inequality in society. So these would be countries like Austria, Denmark, New Zealand, where employees within an organization or citizens within those countries, they feel quite equal to those who might have some authority over them, and they resist a system in which one person has enormous power over others. So they're looking for something that is clearly a bit more democratic, where power is distributed more equally among people. So that's power distance. Moving around that infographic, the next dimension we'll look at is individualism versus collectivism, or called IDV. So this is the degree to which individuals are integrated into groups or acting individually. So individualism, countries that have a strong sense of individualism, people tend to have a preference for kind of loosely knit social frameworks. People are expected to take care of themselves and their immediate families, and there's an emphasis on the individual, the individual's personal achievement, individual freedoms, and the United States is a prime example of a country with a very high IDV. Countries with low IDV are more collective, and they have a preference for tightly knit communities, tightly knit groups, where individuals belong to in-groups, sort of like extended families and organizations that look after one another in exchange for strong loyalty. So the emphasis in these countries is on we, the group, and harmony amongst the members of that group is quite important. Right? So countries that have a low IDV, countries that tend to be more collective are like, for example, China, South Korea, and Venezuela. The next dimension is masculinity versus femininity, or MAS. So this is a dimension in which society's preference for achievement, assertiveness, and material success is labeled masculine, and a society that really puts a preference more on cooperation, modesty, and maybe the quality of life is labeled feminine. So countries with a high MAS, or masculine, masculine approach towards culture. They value competition, heroism, um, assertiveness. There's often a real priority placed on gender roles and gender norms within these countries, and in these cultures, success, the concept of success, is really defined by being the best at something, right? Achievement, competition over others, and so on. So some countries with a really high MAS are Japan, Hungary, and Italy. Countries that are more feminine or have a lower MAS score tend to value cooperation, modesty, caring for maybe the weaker members of society. In these countries, gender roles are maybe a bit more fluid and overlapping. And oftentimes, success is not necessarily defined by being the best or by winning, but by quality of life, by satisfaction, by being happy with the status quo, essentially. Some countries with a low MAS score include Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands. The next dimension on our infographic is Uncertainty Avoidance Index, or UAI. So this indexes a society's tolerance for uncertainty, ambiguity, and risk. Countries that have a high UAI are countries where people feel threatened by ambiguity. So they try to minimize and control aspects of their lives and of the social structure. There's an emotional need for rules, for structure, and reliance on absolute truth. You can find this kind of high UAI in Greece, Portugal, and Japan. Countries with a low UAI are places where people are more relaxed and flexible. They're open to risk taking and new ideas. So you're going to find more progressive or more experimental kinds of people and cultures in these places. In a low UAI country, the rules are less restrictive. The environment tends to be more free-flowing, and you might find a low UAI in countries like Singapore, Denmark, and Jamaica. The next dimension is long-term versus short-term orientation, or LTO. So LTO is the degree to which a society values future-oriented goals and rewards versus the preservation of sort of past and present-oriented traditions. So in a country that has a long-term orientation or high LTO, they put a high value on perseverance and thrift, pragmatic problem solving, preparing for the future. And most of the time they think about tradition as very adaptable to their needs. So countries that have a high LTO are, for example, China, South Korea, and Germany. You might notice those are places that are very industrious. They do have long-standing cultural traditions that they value, but they're also willing to adapt quickly to make the changes necessary to be successful. And so those countries have a high LTO. Countries with a short-term orientation or a low LTO tend to focus on the near future. So what's happening now and what will happen very soon from now. They put a high emphasis on tradition in kind of a rigid way, wanting to not change or vary too much from what they've done in the past. There tends to be an effort to get quick results, to do things that are very grounded in past success, right? They put a high emphasis on established norms and fulfilling a lot of social obligations. So countries with a short-term orientation or a low LTO might include Nigeria, Egypt, and even the United States, which might surprise some of you to hear, because in some ways, when we think about the United States, we do think of a country that's very aggressively pursuing economic growth and things like that. But there really is a high emphasis on norms and social obligation in the United States. So that is long-term versus short-term orientation. The last dimension we'll look at is indulgence versus restraint. So countries with a high IVR, or high level of indulgence, are places where there's a high value placed on gratification of any kind of desire or impulse, a real pursuit of enjoyment of life, high value placed on leisure time, recreation, self-expression. So the USA, Mexico, and Puerto Rico would be some examples of countries with a high IVR, or high level of indulgence. Countries with low levels of indulgence, or more restraint, tend to suppress gratification of needs, and they try to regulate those desires by having sort of a strict set of social norms. They put a high value on duty and order and discipline, and leisure is often much less prioritized. Although, not to say that it doesn't exist, it's just that it doesn't have a central part in life, like it might in some of those more indulgent cultures. So some countries with a high level of restraint would be Russia, Egypt, and Pakistan. So this is a different way of looking at Hofstede's dimensions, and it puts each of these different dimensions on a scale from 0 to 100. And this is actually what Hofstede did in his research, is that he would score each country or culture on his list from 0 to 100. And so you can look down at this list with power distance and individualism, with the feminine versus masculine, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation versus short-term, and then restraint versus indulgence. And countries could be placed at any point along these scales in order for people to quickly reference the culture. And it, of course, it's not perfect, right? Not everyone within that particular country and the culture would score at the same place on this scale, but it's a generalization. And as we mentioned before, with any kind of a model like this, you are by default wrong, right? You can't possibly be absolutely correct in where you score a country, but it's supposed to give people a rough idea of how these cultures might fall on this scale in order that they can more effectively communicate with one another, and kind of go into communication with some deeper understanding of where someone from one of these cultures might fall on the scale. So Hofstede's dimensions are a really helpful tool in reducing the amount of misunderstanding and conflict that might be experienced by people from different cultural backgrounds trying to work together, trying to become a team and work towards common shared goals. So it's just a way of analyzing behavioral differences from different cultural perspectives, and then trying to make communication more effective. You can see how this would be helpful, for example, in a business and management sort of context, where understanding where someone comes from and what their power distance index might be. So people that come from countries with a higher power index are going to expect that those in leadership would have ultimate authority over the team, right? Whereas people that are from more egalitarian cultures with lower PDI would, maybe think that even though there is a leader for a team, that really they're all equals, that they're working together, striving towards a common goal, and that there isn't a great distance between the leader of the team and the members of the team. You can also see how, someone coming from a culture that's high IDV, meaning individualistic, they might be self-motivated, whereas if you're working with people or a company from a country with high collectivism, like China, for example, then you really need to approach it not on the individual basis, not with individual rewards, but by talking about the team effort. Really focusing on and prioritizing the value of the team together as a group working together. This might also come into play with negotiations, diplomacy. You can imagine if you're a marketing team trying to sell a product in a culture that is different from your own, it would be helpful to understand these dimensions in order to better kind of target the audience that you're looking for, to message to them about the product you're selling or the service that you're offering. Getting a better understanding of where they stand and where their culture prioritizes these things is really going to be helpful. Education's another area where having some sense of these cultural dimensions can be very helpful. It means that you might, if you have students that are from a high PDI, power distance index, if they come from countries with how high power distance indexes, then they would, of course, have a different view of the teacher and the role of the teacher, where the teacher might be the ultimate authority in a classroom, whereas in lower power distance countries like the United States, tends to be a more egalitarian classroom where the teacher, especially in higher ed, the teacher sort of places themselves just slightly above maybe where the students are status-wise within a class with the amount of authority that they have. So it changes. It changes, of course, education as well. So you can see these are just tools. These are ways of approaching cross-cultural communication, and having a better understanding of the countries that you are engaging with can really, really make that communication more effective. So this quote here on the screen, I think, summarizes quite well what Geert Hofstede's main purpose was in his research. And he believed that the survival of mankind will depend to a large extent on the ability of people who think differently to act together. And I think that's the real value of this material and the research that he completed. Hopefully the information in this video has been helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.